Warning, listening to Unleash Your Genius can be good for your health.
Symptoms may include looking and feeling better,
More energy, healthier kids, and increased productivity.
Unleash Your Genius podcast brings you the science, art, and philosophy of health, wellness,
Epigenetics and lifestyle. Stronger, fitter, faster.
naturally, holistically, simply.
Hey, what's up, Unleash Your Genius listeners? My guest today is Clare Crew. She's an early childhood and special education teacher who specializes in the brain-body connection. She helps the children the system leaves behind, those with learning, attention, and behavioral challenges. Her message is simple. Children need more movement and play in the early years of life. And when we're able to deliver this in our settings, children begin thriving. Please help me welcome Clare Crew from Thriving Children. Hi, Clare. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. That surprised me for some reason. I'm used to being on the other end of things.
Well, I'm really excited about having you on today. And I know I gave you an introduction, but can you tell us a little bit more about you?
Yeah, so I am an educator. I live in Adelaide in Australia. I've got 3 children of my own, age 5, 7 and 9. And what I do now is largely working with other educators and upskilling them, and also with individual families. So I'm really supporting the children that the system leaves behind.
How did you get started in working with children?
I've always loved working with children. You know, I was the teenager who loved my young cousins coming over, and I'd plan activities and stuff to do with them. And pretty much from the age of 15, I had my heart set on being a preschool teacher, which is essentially what I did. And, you know, I still love the role now, to be honest. I just can't do everything all at this point in my life.
Right. And so what gave you the direction to head into where you are now?
So, you know, as I said, from a young age, I knew that I wanted to be a teacher. And so by the time I finished my 4 years at uni doing early childhood education, I was really pumped and really excited once I actually graduated and had my first class. But I just found that, you know, uni had really skimmed over the additional needs part of the piece. And in all of the first groups of children that I taught, whether it was in a junior primary class or whether it was in a preschool, there were always quite a few kids with high needs. And I just really didn't feel like I had the confidence or the skills to do my absolute best for them. And because that was a pattern that continued in my first few contracts, I went back to university in my free time, you know, when you're teaching full time, and got my master's degree in special ed. And that was amazing. It was everything I wanted it to be in some ways. And yet I found that, you know, there would still be children that I'd be teaching who wouldn't actually tick the boxes for a formal diagnosis,
Right.
but who still were giving me those alarm bells developmentally. And I never really had the answers for them. And it wasn't until I became a mum myself and I started working part-time as a Gymbaroo teacher that I first heard about these things called primitive reflexes and really started to go, oh my goodness, you know, this describes that group of children who I could never quite pinpoint. And it really just got me so excited about the connection between movement and learning.
Nice. As a chiropractor, you know, when I started focusing with kids, primitive reflexes was one of the main topics that they really focused on with us. And, you know, I think it's pretty much the only place that I really heard about primitive reflexes. Is that becoming more popular now, or is there an awareness about primitive reflexes that I just wasn't aware of beforehand?
Yeah, I didn't know about it until, you know, when I was in the hospital having my first child, and I saw them check them for a few things, and that was the first and last I'd heard about it really until listening to you.
Yeah, and in truth, that's really the limit of it. As you said, Brian, there's some chiropractors. Most chiropractors are aware of them. Some do specific work targeting them. If we're talking about pediatricians, they're aware of them and they're wanting to see them after birth, which I absolutely agree with. But then it's just assumed really that this process of integration or using up the reflexes will naturally unfold. And beyond that newborn period, most people aren't really aware of them and the impact that they can have on child development. So I wouldn't say that it's become common knowledge. I'm working really, really hard to spread the message for parents and for teachers. And I know there are people like me around the world, but I think our voice is still too quiet compared to the bigger voices and compared to people that advocate the medication and all the other kind of stuff. There's no, it is intervention that can be so powerful for children and so affordable. And so there's almost not the interest from the big people in the world in it.
So are you working with the kids now, or do you help other people recognize teachers and parents about primitive reflexes, and then you have strategies to deal with that?
Yeah, so a bit of everything really, Brian. It's so one thing that I do is I run one-day workshops for educators. So really just giving them a new pair of eyes with which to see their students, actually saying, all those kids that you can't quite pinpoint what's going on for them developmentally, it's likely this. And you see, the light bulbs going off behind their very eyes. And then training them in a program called Move to Learn, which is a movement-based program designed for classrooms that an educator can do with a whole group of children to repeat the movement milestones that a baby does in the first year of life, thereby helping them to move past that stuck stage of development. Another thing that I do is working with families individually. So, if sometimes it's actually a child who has a teacher who's trained with me. So therefore, the teacher's kind of speaking that language to the family, and then they want a bit of additional, more intensive sort of support and hand-holding. But sometimes it is the parents who have gone through the process of trying to have a diagnosis of something and it's all come back negative. But, as parents, we have that inner wisdom when something isn't quite right, and we might be told constantly that, they're fine, they'll grow out of it, you're making a mountain out of a molehill, but they know. And so eventually, normally they stumble across my blog or my website or my podcast, and they start to resonate with this idea of the primitive reflexes, and that it might be getting in the way of their child's ability to reach their full potential.
So if, as a parent, or I guess as a teacher, like if you suspect that might be the issue with a particular child, what does that look like necessarily, or what are some sort of little signs that you might look for if you think that might be the issue?
Well, I'll touch on that, but maybe firstly I should explain what they are, because we've just been saying most people have no idea. And so I think to put it into context, it's good to know where they originate from. So essentially the primitive reflexes are like the automatic movement patterns that a baby makes in response to the world around them. And they develop during pregnancy. They're there for three main functions for newborn babies. So they help with the birth process, they help our survival in those first weeks and months of life, and they also provide the baby with enough sensory and motor input to kickstart that process of brain development. So it's kind of like they're a little sponge, and that's, the little spark. Everything needs to get going. So for newborns, we want them there. As I said earlier, the pediatrician wants to make sure they're in place. But they, all those three functions I talked about all happen in very early life. And so the function and the purpose of those reflexes has really gone by the time a child turns 6 to 12 months of age. And by the time a baby celebrates their first birthday, we don't want any of those reflexes to still be there. So essentially what happens in that first year of life is the baby uses up or integrates those reflexes through movement. So if we think about all of those movement milestones that a baby achieves in the first year of life, For example, being able to lift up their own head, being able to raise their head and their chest together off the floor when they're on their tummy, being able to roll, being able to commando crawl on their bellies, being able to rock on hands and knees, crawl on hands and knees, do all of those things that eventually get them from being a pancake on the floor to being on their feet. You know, all of those movement milestones are very purposeful for many reasons, but one of which is the process of reflex integration. And so in theory, by the time we turn 1, the reflexes are gone. But sometimes a child might miss a certain movement milestone. Crawling is quite a common one to miss, for example. And very much the message spread out there online is that it's okay to not crawl. And I would beg to differ. Sometimes a child has achieved all of their milestones physically, but maybe not done one for long enough, with enough intensity for what their body needed to get through that process of integration. Or sometimes, which is what happened with my own children, there was stress during the pregnancy, which meant that that whole process of reflex integration kind of stalled. So even though they had a great birth, even though they had heaps of tummy time, and even though I was implementing what I recommend others to implement, that stress in utero kind of stopped everything evolving as it should, and they've needed a bit more remedial work at an older age to kind of get things on track again. So that's what they are. So the challenges that a child will have if the reflexes are still there and they're, say, 3 or 5 or 10, or if you're 30 even and you're listening in, they're going to be quite unique to you and very reflective of the specific reflexes that you've still got. So, for example, if you've still got your Moro reflex, you're quite likely to be hyperactive. You're quite likely.
That's the startle reflex?
That's the startle reflex.
Right.
Yeah. So in a baby, this reflex is the startle one. And for those of you who have had interaction with a newborn baby, you remember it quite well because it's such a physical response. So when there is a sudden change of sensory input, whether it's a bright light, a loud noise, sudden change of body temperature, sudden change of body position, then the baby's arms fling out to the side. There's a big sharp intake of breath. Adrenaline and cortisol are released into the bloodstream. There's a big loud cry, and then typically the baby's arms kind of come back into the trunk again afterwards. And so, you know, that's a really powerful survival type response for a baby. It's what gives them that first breath of air. It's very evident when you've got a newly born baby, because as soon as they put them on the scales, that's the response that actually happens. But that's the reflex where if you've still got it later in life, you have big problems with sensory processing because you're still really easily triggered by changes. Loud noises is a very common trigger, for example, and not just changes in a sensory way, but change full stop. Because for these kids, they just don't feel safe and secure at their core. And, you know, this is not reflective of the educators that work with them or how lovely the family is. It's just how they're wired at this moment in time. And so the way that they do feel safe and secure is to have a very predictable structure. They need to know what's happening and when and why. They need pre-warning if anything changes. And ideally, they want to be the boss. They want to be dictating what happens. They tend to be really hyperactive. Lots of kids with ADHD, well, all the kids with ADHD I've worked with have had a strong Moro reflex. And I don't know if this is widespread, but certainly those I've worked with, as you integrate the Moro reflex, they wouldn't actually tick enough boxes for ADHD anymore. Right. Digestion is a big one because you're in that whole fight or flight response all the time. And so digestion is secondary. Same with things like fertility, so that can be a bit of a problem for females as we get older and we get to the stage where we do want a family. There's just so many challenges. If, for example, you've got your hand reflexes still, you're going to struggle with fine motor skills, with handwriting. If you've still got some of your oral reflexes, you might struggle with speech. You might struggle with eating foods that have, you know, a certain texture. specifically, food that you actually have to chew quite well and work towards getting down, rather than food that you just it just disintegrates and you just swallow it down. Children who have the fear paralysis reflex are the ones who are very anxious. They might struggle with separation anxiety beyond that toddlerhood age, where it's quite a normal part of development. They might have selective mutism. They might have lots of issues with phobias and, sleepwalking and excessive nightmares and things like that. So you can see that, you can have 10 different children in front of you with 10 very different challenges, and they'll all present quite differently. So it can impact on learning, on attention, behaviour, coordination, and your emotional well-being, and not necessarily all of those. It really depends on you and your reflex profile.
So what are some of the things that can cause a retained reflex? I think you mentioned in utero, with your child, there was some stress there. Is it
Yeah. So a big one is stress in utero. So we're talking physical stress. So that could be like with all of my 3 pregnancies, intrauterine growth restriction, where they didn't get as much goodness as they needed in that last trimester. It can be things like preeclampsia, gestational diabetes. It can be chemical stress. So, for example, and I think the threshold really depends on genetics too a little bit. But for some children who are genetically a bit vulnerable, I think even just a course of antibiotics during the pregnancy might throw them over the edge. Vaccinations during the pregnancy, mothers who have epilepsy, for example, and it's much safer to continue the medication than to stop, which I'd agree with, but we need to be aware that there might be ramifications for baby. And also emotional stress. So it might be that, your mum has cancer when you're pregnant, or, your partner loses his job and there's big financial strain, or maybe you're just someone that is highly, highly anxious or heavily depressed and you're pregnant at the same time. So those things during pregnancy can definitely mean there's issues from the get-go. Definitely, some of the kids I've worked with, there were no challenges during the pregnancy, but they might not have breathed, for example, for, 5 minutes at birth. And that, in my mind, puts you straight back to that fear paralysis reflex because your survival has been threatened. Another one is cesarean section. So I'm grateful that they exist. And I think that they are amazing when the mother's health or the baby's health is in jeopardy, but they're being overused. There is 1 in 3 in South Australia. I think that's pretty much Australia-wide. I know that in Brazil and I think India, it's 90% of babies are born via cesarean.
Wow.
And the thing about cesareans, it doesn't necessarily mean you're guaranteed to have a child with challenges. But what it does mean is that reflex development is starting off sort of 1 step behind. Because while the reflexes develop during the pregnancy and they're fully in place at about 37 weeks gestation, it's actually the deep pressure of contractions and the deep pressure of moving through the birth canal, which essentially, gets them fully mature because the baby knows that it's showtime. It's ready for life outside of the womb, which is what these reflexes are all about.
So how can we give our kids the best start? Are there some things that we should practice initially to make sure that they develop their reflexes normally?
Definitely. So a big one is just to try and stress less during pregnancy. If you do have a premature delivery or if you do have a cesarean section, you can get the right movement input to your baby pretty soon after birth, and that sort of helps them to catch up and get them at the point where they're ready to absorb all the other goodness that's on offer. Tummy time is a really, really big one. I know you'd be in support of this as a chiropractor, Brian. Tummy time is so ignored in today's society. We are so obsessed with putting babies in things, in the capsule, in the bumbo chair, in the jolly jumper, in the walker thing that's not called a walker anymore because it's got no wheels, but really the position the child's in is exactly like a walker. The message about tummy time is there, but it's not loud enough. And so we're going with convenience, and, you know, we're putting children in compromised positions, in positions that they're not yet developmentally ready for. And, you know, really, we should be letting a child dictate when they're ready, no matter what age they're dictating that. So if I had my time over again, because I did use some of those devices, especially with my first, I wouldn't have them at all. But if you do feel like there's a place for them, at least essentially triple the time they're in something with time on the floor. That's incredibly important. For a lot of the reflexes, you need that free range of movement. One called the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, for example, or the ATNR, is like a connection between the head and the arm. So as the head, for example, turns to the left arm extends fully and the eyes gaze to the fingers and the hands. So it helps with that early eye-hand coordination training. Likewise, if the head turns to the right, then the right arm extends. But it can happen in reverse too, where if the arm moves first, then the head turns to follow. Now, if you think about a baby in a capsule, how can they do that arm extension when their head turns? And I know capsules are important. Well, you know, car seats of some kind and prams are important for getting safely from A to B, but too many people will just leave their baby in them when they get somewhere because they're asleep or because they're quiet and content or because they're staring at the iPhone that they've for some reason been given, that they, you know, they're not getting that free range of movement. They haven't got enough room to wriggle and squirm. They're not gaining that head control. And that's a big part of that initial reflex integration process.
So keep them on the floor and just have them move around as much as they can.
Absolutely. And, you know, support those milestones. So do value and appreciate crawling. Don't interrupt that crawling process by standing them up and holding their hands and helping them to walk, because they're going to know how to walk when they've laid the foundations for that milestone. And in actual fact, as soon as you start doing that, they're less content with the crawling. They're no longer going to crawl for the amount of time that inner wisdom tells them to. And once they are standing, you know, they do have a very different visual field from which to see the world, and they quite like it. So they're going to keep demanding those things on us. So I think so much of it just comes back to taking a step back and letting child development evolve as it naturally needs to. But I guess also as part of that is recognizing if a little bit of a nudge is needed. For example, if a baby just isn't getting up on hands and knees, then they're not necessarily going to crawl without a little bit of help. Likewise with crawling, some of the children that I work with will be bum shuffling instead, or they might have a weird leg drag, and just doing a little bit of movement therapy or chiropractic adjustment or both, depends on the child, that can just get everything in place so that then they're back on track with that natural process unfolding.
Yeah, I think a lot of that too comes back maybe to moms having a different kind of idea because I can remember as a new mom, I had a couple of mates and some ladies I met in my pregnancy class. It all became really quite competitive as to how quickly your kid was doing whatever it was supposed to do next. And so you kind of, I think that's where a lot of that, you know, trying to force the child to walk before they probably would have on their own, or, you know, encouraging them to do stuff that they wouldn't necessarily have done without you kind of pushing the process, comes into it, I think, with that whole kind of competitive side of it, as opposed to just leaving the child to do what it does. And at the same time, our eldest daughter, she never really did actually crawl. She put her head on the floor and her bum in the air and kind of pushed her legs along with her head on the ground, like their butt up. I'm just thinking about that now as you're talking. I'm like,
head control. Yeah.
I wonder what's going on with that. I might take a look at it. But yeah, I think there's so much competition around kids and pressure on them too.
Agreed. And it's a really horrible culture if you think about it, because we've got these parents who have their self-esteem attached to their child's abilities. And, it's bad enough when they get to school and these parents are pushed with the academic agenda because their child has to get A's and be amazing and impress everyone. But if we think about babies, like, we're assuming that we know what's best for them, when in actual fact they come along with this little biological blueprint for development, and it's not an instruction book, so we tend not to respect the fact that they know what's best for them in many cases. And the whole competition side of things, I do find it ridiculous, because to me, through my lens, I would much prefer a child does all their milestones and does them for long enough than at what age they do them. And for some children, that means they're not actually up walking until 2. But if that means they got 5 months of crawling, I'm less likely to see that child as a 10-year-old who's having issues. A lot of the ones that I see are the ones who didn't crawl, or maybe, crawled for a couple of weeks and were up walking at 10 months of age. That isn't a sign of intelligence. I mean, well, sometimes the giftedness literature says that it is, but to me, I have those alarm bells if things are rushed.
Yeah.
So they have to tick all the boxes, right? That's what you want to see, is to have specific time with their head being raised, specific times crawling. Is that true, or just? I mean, I guess everyone would be individual in that sense as well.
Yeah. I'm not prescriptive. I'm not there with my little my little notes saying, oh no, they've only crawled for 3.5 months. That's just not long enough. And obviously with 3 children, I've seen that individual difference with each of them. One did crawl for 5 months, which I learned was the ideal, but the others, it was between 3.5 to 4 months. But what I am saying is that the visual training they had, the hemispheric integration they had, the reflex integration they had from crawling for that long, far exceeds a child who crawled for 2 weeks. Right. But I think even more so, it's just valuing those milestones along the way, So I do inherit children who have previously seen a paediatrician or who are seeing a paediatrician at that point in time. And I'm sure that some are more focused on the movement side of things, but the families I've inherited, have been told it doesn't matter if your child doesn't crawl, they're 12 months old. We just now have to get their legs strong for walking. So let's have, a couple of hours a day in a walker.
Right.
And looking at it through my perspective, I go, oh, well, it might get their legs strong for walking, but you're missing so much. And really, your legs will be strong enough for walking when you go through all the motions beforehand, because that process of developing postural control, that ability to be upright, it's an individual game and it can't be raced. And we see the results of it constantly in the classroom when a child has raced it or hasn't gone through the motions with enough intensity, because they're the kids who struggle to sit up. They're the kids who struggle to sit still. They're the ones who are almost laying across the table, propping their head up in their hands. They still can't sufficiently hold up the weight of their head because they didn't go through that process in the first year of life properly.
Right. So, okay, I'm thinking about the teachers and the parents as well. So let's say that a child has gone through and they still are retaining some of those reflexes, and you might be seeing this in the classroom, right? With you mentioned attention deficit and maybe some behavioral challenges. Is there any strategies that some tips that you could give our teachers or parents that might help them deal with this?
Absolutely. So a big one is that there needs to be more movement in the classroom, because movement is so intertwined with learning and with how the brain works, even not from this reflex perspective. So we can't stop one, as in the movement, and expect the other one to happen. We can't get kids to sit still for 6 hours a day and expect them to still be learning. So more movement in the classroom is definitely helpful from the point of view of, fitness, movement breaks. I'd love to see more swings back in playgrounds. That would be awesome, but they seem to be going, as do monkey bars. And the main thing is really almost just the philosophy of just recognising I think as teachers, when a child is playing up, especially in the older years at school, we really take it personally. And we really feel like they're questioning our authority and they're being defiant and they're being lazy and they're being this and they're being that. But in actual fact, you've got to go into things with that mindset of being a detective, because all behaviour is giving us clues. It's all communication. And in my mind, I'm yet to work with a child who is any of those labels I just dished out. Because if you dig deep enough, there's always a developmental reason for the behaviours they're exhibiting. And too often those kids are reprimanded and they're given consequences and punishments rather than the actual support and understanding they need. And beyond that change to your mindset and beyond just more general movement in the classroom and in the child's day at home as well, it is also, knowing that you can go back in time essentially from a neurological perspective and repeat the kinds of movements that a baby does in that first year of life to give the brain and the body that second chance to connect, to actually integrate those reflexes again. And I'm an individual who was drawn to this field, I know now, because I had all of my reflexes as an adult and I had lots of challenges in my life because of that. And I've integrated almost all of mine now through doing the movement work. And typically the younger you are, the quicker you see those shifts. So if you are in a classroom setting, if you're teaching, or a preschool childcare setting, you can do Move to Learn. If you are a parent, then I probably recommend rhythmic movement training. It's a bit more intensive. It's definitely a better one if you've got a child who's quite anxious. Or has some of those pregnancy and birth type challenges going on. So there's providers of that worldwide who can support you along the journey. But also if you're remote or if you can't finance it, then there's an ebook from Move to Learn called 10 Gems for the Brain. And that's $20. And that tells you what you need to do, really. And just through that, you can get some huge shifts and improvements.
Well, is that the rhythmic movement training? Is that what you're...
So rhythmic movement training is what I do with my individual family. So that's something that you pay a consultant to help you with each session. Move to Learn is the one created by Barbara Furlong quite some years ago in the 80s. And that's the program that is great for classroom use and that you can buy the $20 ebook for and do it yourself essentially.
Great, thank you. And I was just browsing through your website, and I also noticed a listening program.
Yeah, the listening program, I don't do as much of it anymore, to be honest. So that was one of the first, I trained in that shortly before I trained in primitive reflexes, ages ago now. So some of the families that I work with want to do that as well, and it really helps shift some things a little bit faster with auditory processing and sensory integration, but it's also much more of a financial investment. So I find that the families I'm working with typically want to do the movement stuff, knowing that that's an option later, and often by working on the reflexes, the auditory processing significantly improves anyway.
Nice.
Another bit I'll add is homework. We need to stop giving homework.
Yay, to know
Because,
homework.
how can kids get that movement and play and connection that they need after school when we're just giving them more and more of that academic-based work? And the research just doesn't support homework, so I don't get why we're so emotionally attached to it.
Okay.
Yeah,
I don't get
it. I mean, if I had to think about sitting in a classroom in a seat for as long as my children are expected to sit in a classroom in a seat, I think I would lose my mind.
Yeah.
As an adult, I can't sit still for that long. So it's really hard to expect them to do that and then still come home and do more of it. I'm thinking surely in the time that you have been at school, you're able to cover everything that needs to be covered. Yeah. And I remember once a teacher saying to me something about how I should use it as a bonding experience. To do homework with my child. I was like, I'm pretty sure I can come up with some better stuff.
Absolutely. And I think it's really it's really narrow-minded to think that all a child needs to learn to be successful in life is that which can be provided through the academic medium and classroom-based activities. You know, like I was saying before with the milestones, I really believe we as human beings, children probably even more so, we know what we need for our development. And so with the freedom to do so, some children will go and run laps around outside or go crazy at the playground. Some children will just need to rest. Some will read a book by choice. You know, you can really see their interests and their yearnings that they couldn't actually act on during the day coming out. And I think as well, it means that you as their parent are their ally. You're there with the unconditional love and with the support, but you're not there barking more orders at them, continuing the vein of that adult-directed day that they've already been in, you know. So you're a team just going through life together rather than, you know, another version of the teacher.
Yeah, teacher at home.
Yeah, exactly. That's not what children need, especially children who are struggling. You know, often it's said that the children who are struggling need the homework to catch up. They are the children that homework does the most damage to, because even if it's only 20 minutes that a teacher sets them, it might take them 2 hours. There's so much pressure, and really that child would be better spending their time doing something that they feel confident in or that they're enthusiastic about, and at the same time recharging their self-esteem, recharging their energy, ready for the next day of school tomorrow.
Hey, Claire, what if you have a 6-year-old who won't sit still during dinner?
I would
Funny
just start,
that he asks that.
I'm guessing this might be in your house.
Can you solve a small wager that we have?
I would say, you know, part of it is if a child is moving lots and they can't sit still, it's because that's where they're at developmentally. So, you know, you've kind of got to balance it. And I would try, if that was my child, I would try not to say over and over again that they need to sit still, because then they're essentially hearing the message that there's something wrong with them. But at the same time, be doing some work behind the scenes to get them to a point where they can actually find those moments of stillness, because the vestibular system is our balance system. And the most sophisticated act that it helps us to do is to be still. So if you're constantly on the move, you're not at a point where you can find that stillness, especially if it's something that isn't engaging you as much as maybe like playing with the Lego or doing whatever the passion project is. So I would probably, definitely make sure chiropractic adjustments are there. Definitely make sure that they're getting, you know, great real food into their bellies rather than anything with additives or preservatives, which can actually, I guess, make that hyperactivity heightened. And I'd also be adding in some movement. So finding a rhythmic movement training practitioner or doing some move to learn. And with both of those programs, it's ideally a daily thing that you do, but it might take anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. It's really not much of your time for the results that you start to see.
Right. See, the best part of doing a podcast is free.
Oh,
yeah, that's right. Free
Lord.
consulting.
Free consulting. Thanks, Claire.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
The wiggling at the table is driving me slightly crazy at the moment.
Yeah.
She can be really quiet. Like, she sits quietly doing other things. Literally, she stands at the dinner table. She doesn't want to sit down, so she'll stand at the dinner table and eat her food.
And do you think it's because she's had too much sitting down time already, or does she have any fussiness with eating as well? Like, is that a coping type strategy, or?
I think it's just because she's at school all day. That was my theory, is that she's sitting so much now. She just kind of likes to move. She's pretty active most of the time, anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe you need to Google IKEA hacks for dining tables and create a stand-up dining table.
Right.
Yeah.
She's ahead of the curve with the stand-up.
Yeah, that's right. Just standing next to it, you know, in front of it rather than on it. That might be a bit more socially acceptable.
Nice. So, Claire, is there anything else we should cover that you want to cover now? What is there a direction?
I don't think so. I think the main thing is just that, you know, the way I see it, the most important thing with children is that connection with other human beings, you know, that unconditional love. And so I think it's really important to trust them and trust that they know what they need, and, you know, to give them more freedom freedom to play, freedom to move, freedom to express themselves in the way that they need to. And if we feel that some of those expressions aren't really okay, part of it sometimes is us readdressing our own expectations, because quite often, frankly, they're a bit unrealistic, especially in the school system. But also then perhaps seeing that as those clues that need a little bit of support on the side developmentally to nudge a bit closer to the right direction.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do and how our listeners can get a hold of you in case they would like some more information?
Sure. So my business name is Thriving Children. So you can just Google that or go to thrivingchildren.com.au. And on there, lots of blog posts. There's a link to my podcast, which is called the Thriving Children Podcast. So that's in iTunes. And an events page where it talks about the events I've got, most of which are for teachers, but there's a few that are specifically for parents or tick the boxes for parents and teachers.
Are you coming out to Brisbane anytime soon?
I'm not on my own, but I'm part of a tour called the Big 8 this year, and we are coming to Brisbane. So for teachers who are listening, they might have heard of Mark Armitage. I'm guessing you guys probably haven't.
No.
So he's a play worker. So I've spoken at the National Play Conference that he organises last year, and I am again this year as well. And I've been invited to do the Big 8, which is for parents and for teachers, or pretty much anyone that works with children with additional needs. So it's going to be one day with 4 different speakers talking about play and children with additional needs. So mine will obviously have my own spin on it, my part of the day, and going to 8 different spots in Australia, which will be pretty exciting. Nice. So maybe I'll get there on my own steam one day, but no plans as yet.
Okay. Hey, Claire, it's been so fantastic having you. Thank you for your time. And it was a fascinating talk today. I love talking about development in kids and the nervous system and how it all functions. So thank you so much for today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having
me.
Thanks a bit.
Thanks so much for listening to Unleash Your Genius with your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit unleashyourgenius.com. We'll catch you next time.